Dene-Caucasian has been repeatedly discovered by several scholars from several starting points, each seeing only a part of the whole, as in the fable of the blind men discovering the elephant. Recent advances in historical linguistics allow us to view the complete elephant more and more clearly. In a recent video on this channel, we looked at a language family proposal connecting the Yeniseian languages of Central Siberia with the Na-Dene language family of northwestern North America. This proposal, Dene-Yeniseian, has been pushed forward in recent years by the hard work of researcher Edward Vida and has managed to garner some traction in the linguistic community. However, both the Na-Dene and Yeniseian language families feature as part of a much larger, much more controversial language family proposal, the Dene-Caucasian Hypothesis. And that is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome, I'm Learn Hittite, and this is your introduction to the Dene-Caucasian Hypothesis. The Dene-Caucasian hypothesis, whilst having a few different flavours, centres around four language families: Na-Dene, Yeniseian, North Caucasian and Sino-Tibetan. Actually, the origin of the term Dene-Caucasian is somewhat elusive. Linguist and long-ranger John Bengtson, who actually sadly passed away earlier this year, attributed coinage of the term equally to Sergei Starostin, Sergei Nikolaev and Vitaly Shchevorodkin. You might have noticed here the term Sino-Caucasian. Now, Sino-Caucasian is a language macro family proposed by Sergei Starostin in the early 1980s. In his proposal, Starostin attempted to show a genetic connection between three Old World language families: North Caucasian, Yeniseian and Sino-Tibetan. Interestingly, Edward Vida has a video on his YouTube channel on Sino-Caucasian, and in it he is very praising of Starostin and his work, noting his deep knowledge of Old Chinese, Sino-Tibetan, and his field and documentation work concerning Ket, a member of the Yeniseian language family. Vida also highlights his etymological dictionary of North Caucasian. And basically in the video, Vida is laying out Starostin's extremely good qualifications and background concerning the component languages of the Sino-Caucasian hypothesis. Now, we can't look at Dene-Caucasian without at least taking a glance of Sino-Caucasian, because it contains three of those four central language families we identified as being core to Dene-Caucasian. Here's a summary of Starostin's early findings concerning the proposal. And actually, let me know if you'd be interested in a dedicated video on Sino-Caucasian. So the first text to check out is Shchevorodkin's book, because it features an English translation of Starostin's early work on Sino-Caucasian. It's basically just a long list of lexical comparisons alongside a look into the rather complicated phonologies of the language groups involved. Luckily for us, Van Driem in 2005 did a kind of overview of language family proposals concerning the prehistory of Chinese, and here the author covers Starostin's Sino-Caucasian. And this overview was actually sent to reviewers just shortly before Sergei Starostin unfortunately passed away in 2005. So despite the fact that this overview is a few years old now, the article actually represents the summit of Starostin's output on Sino-Caucasian. Now Van Driem notes a few things, Firstly, that whilst the number of lexical comparisons is high, at 1,358, not all the terms are expressed in every branch. In fact, only 130 are found in all branches, and the data for Sino-Tibetan is often lacking. Some reconstructions are also vague in terms of meaning, and for example, there are 5 reconstructed forms for pus, but only one of them is reflected in all branches. Van Driem also highlights the lack of evidence regarding morphological correspondences. M interrogative is supposedly found in Sino-Caucasian, but as we know from previous videos, it's common in many languages and proposed language families. There is some contribution to the topic by other researchers, for example Romanchuk in 2012. But for a moment, let's go back and take a look at a few of the interesting correspondences Van Driem identified within Sino-Caucasian. So how do we get from the 3 language families of Sino-Caucasian to the 4 central families in Dene-Caucasian? Well, Bengtson noted that in 1988, Sergei Nikolaev raised eyebrows at the first international symposium on language and prehistory when he presented a report on the Sino-Caucasian languages in America. The report put forward evidence showing correspondences between the Na-Dene language family and the Sino-Caucasian macro family that we just looked at. The audience was particularly struck by the extreme similarity between Na-Dene and North Caucasian forms, and Bengtson added that the phonological systems are very similar, and that rather than representing common developments, the similarities are rather reflective of a deep genetic relationship. And actually, going back to the symposium itself, when you look at the list of people who contributed to or attended the symposium, it's pretty much a who's who of the linguistic community for the late 1980s. So if this calibre of audience is impressed, it says something about the data presented. Nikolaev was the first scholar to actively compare in depth Na-Dene and Caucasian language families. Bengtson suggested that Nikolaev's work was a natural culmination of previous research by Sapir and Schaefer on the Sino-Dene hypothesis and by Starostin's Sino-Caucasian. By the early 90s, Nikolaev had essentially developed the nascent form of the Dene-Caucasian hypothesis as we know it today. The general state of thinking within the community at this time was exemplified by a 1991 book edited by Verushaski, which featured Nikolaev's work and commentary by Bengtson. This book remains essential reading for those interested in the hypothesis. Although there were earlier suggestions of something akin to the Dene-Caucasian hypothesis, such as Trombetti's work from 1925, much of the earlier evidence has been disregarded or substantially revised and modified. It is Nikolaev's extension of these hypotheses, Sino-Dene and Sino-Caucasian, that marks the birth of the Dene-Caucasian hypothesis as we understand it today. For those familiar with the Dene-Caucasian hypothesis, you might have noticed that we haven't yet mentioned 2 languages often included in this family, Basque and Burushaski. In 1994, Merit Ruchlen built on Starostin's work in the Russian language on Sino-Caucasian, translating it into English and incorporating comparisons to Basque and Burushaski. Ilya Peiros had earlier, in 1988, made lexical comparisons between Sino-Caucasian and Burushaski. Then, in 1995, Blazek and Bengtson published the following text, adding to the comparisons involving Basque and Burushaski. Over the next 2 decades, Bengtson continued to elaborate on Dene-Caucasian, building on Starostin's original Sino-Caucasian framework. Based on Bengtson and George Starostin's 2015 work, we can outline the 6 branches of Dene-Caucasian as follows. We have North Caucasian, combining the sub-branches of Northeast Caucasian and Northwest Caucasian. Currently, genetic unity is not universally recognised here. Next up, we have Sino-Tibetan, with two sub-branches, Chinese and Tibeto-Burmese. This branch is generally accepted as a whole, but with some internal subgrouping issues. Major works include Benedict 1972 and Peiros and Starostin 1996. Yeniseian we should now all be somewhat familiar with because of the previous video on the Dene-Kaukasian hypothesis. The only remaining language of the family spoken is Ket, with only a handful of speakers, but we do have historical data on extinct relatives. And key works concerning Yeniseian are obviously those of Vaida and Starostin. Burushaski, also not too long ago we had a video on that. The Burushaski family features three closely related dialects in the Hindu-Kush area. We have the Basque branch. The inclusion of Basque is quite tentative. It's based on regular correspondences, particularly with North Caucasian. And finally we have the Na-Dene branch of North America. We have two major sub-branches, and also we have the controversial position of Haida. Some researchers include Haida in Na-Dene, others don't. So for example, when we looked at the Dene-Yeniseian hypothesis, Vaida doesn't include Haida as part of Na-Dene. However, Bengtson, for example, has gone on record as saying that its inclusion or exclusion from Na-Dene has no overall bearing on the Dene-Caucasian hypothesis as a whole. These branches illustrate the diverse and complex nature of the proposed Dene-Caucasian language family, with ongoing research needed for full validation. Now, there are some kind of Tagalong languages that are sometimes included in Dene-Caucasian. Let's take a quick look at some of the more interesting inclusions. In 2010, Cassian presented data linking Hattic, an ancient Anatolian language, to the Sino-Caucasian family. Cassian notes in his work that the comparison is restricted to Sino-Caucasian simply because an adequate reconstruction of Na-Dene didn't exist at the time of writing the research. The bulk of Cassian's argument centres around a list of 68 cognates alongside a number of grammatical morpheme correspondences. A year later, Cassian repeated his endeavours, but this time with Hurro-Urartian. Etruscan and Sumerian have at points been connected with Dene-Caucasian, but Bengtson and George Starostin have described the status of these two languages inside Dene-Caucasian as shaky, although there are some small teasing examples of potential correspondences. Bengtson published a nice analysis of Sumerian as a Dene-Caucasian language in issue 3 of Mother Tongue. It's well worth a read, and most of the evidence presented focuses on lexical comparisons, but the text also features some insight into the Sumerian verb, and as we'll see later, complex verb structures seem to be a thing that unites all of the supposed Dene-Caucasian languages. We can see on screen now a short excerpt from Bengtson's article where he comments on the similarities between the Sumerian and Na-Dene prefixing verb complexes. Perhaps most controversially, Szeweroszkin has proposed the inclusion of the Salish Wakashan languages of North America. The evidence that Szeweroszkin provides is limited to comparisons with North Caucasian, and more about this proposal can be found here. The internal classification of the Dene-Caucasian family is, as you can probably imagine, highly debated. And actually authors don't even seem to expect the internal classification to be reliably resolved, considering the time depths involved. The proto-language, for example, is estimated by Bengtson and Starostin to have existed some 10,000 years ago. Let's take a look at three classifications anyway. The first by Sergei Starostin. And next, a version by George Starostin. And finally, Bengtson's classification. So, some interesting trees here. We can see that Sergei Starostin saw the position of Na-Dene somewhat differently to his colleagues, and the position of Yeniseian is the biggest contrast in the classifications put forward by Bengtson and George Starostin. Now, before we get into the proposed evidence behind the Dene-Caucasian hypothesis, I'd just like to make a comment or two around the genesis of the proposal, because oftentimes I see that it comes in for a lot of criticism online. Firstly, the scholars that essentially gave birth to the hypothesis, like Starostin, Nikolaev, Sheveroshkin, Bengtson, these are known, respected researchers. Yeah, critics might well say that they are all just lumpers, but they are serious researchers, each contributing significantly to the literature of the language families in question. And narrower groupings from within the family do have some traction within the community. So it's not, as I've necessarily seen presented in some places, as just some random lumping of every language family that didn't make it into the Nostratic or Ostric language family proposals. Although, I will be honest, I did kind of think just that before I started my own deeper dive. And yeah, it's important to remember that the original symposium which led to the Dene Sino-Caucasian book in 1991 was stacked with serious minds. So perhaps we shouldn't just disregard the proposal on the basis of its scale or apparent lumpiness. What we should do, however, is review the evidence that is being presented to us. Now, we're going to look at some of that evidence in just a moment, but of course other linguists have already taken a look and pulled it apart. Yakontov has pointed out potential issues with the reconstruction of cultural concepts for the Dene-Caucasian language family, suggesting that some of the reconstructions presented likely do not correspond to actual objects from the projected time period of this macro family. Yakontov further highlights the reliance on lexical comparisons in the proposal and the relative lack of good morphological evidence. Maybe there is something to be said about whether Dene-Caucasian is just one step too far. Just because there is evidence supporting some of the internal relationships in the proposal, like Dene-Yeniseian, as we've spoken about, it obviously says nothing about Dene-Caucasian as a whole. And just because a researcher is a supporter of a narrower grouping of languages within Dene-Caucasian doesn't mean that they are a supporter of the grand macro language family as a whole. Although researchers like Vida seem at least open to the proposal and see merit in its further research. I'd also like to share an important observation made by some authors. For example, by Paul Whitehouse in Volume 3 of Mother Tongue. Namely, that some of these lexical correspondences may well be the result of borrowing, and are not necessarily indicative of a genetic relationship. Take the view put forward by linguist Roger Blench. He concludes that Burushaski has almost no native crop and livestock vocabulary, instead borrowing heavily from Dardic and Tibeto-Burman for terms connected to crops, and from Caucasian and Dardic for livestock names, hinting strongly that Burushaski speakers were originally hunter-gatherers who adopted agriculture following contact with their neighbours. In my eyes, the parallels identified between those 6 primary branches of Dene-Caucasian may represent a much more complicated interplay of areal zones, borrowings and inheritance, rather than just every connection being a genetic one. Finally, however, it is important to also remember that when you read the papers on Dene-Caucasian, it is clear that Bengtson and other researchers are firmly aware of the many limitations of the proposal and have listened to a lot of the heavy criticism it has come in for. Trask battered the inclusion of Basque in the Dene-Caucasian Hypothesis in 1995 and 1996, but many of the issues that Trask raised have allowed advocates of Basque's inclusion to go back to the drawing board and refine their proposals. A good third of Bengtson's and George Starostin's State of the Art of Dene-Caucasian from 2015 concerns the limitations and issues surrounding the proposal. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that those working on, or those who have worked on the proposal, aren't just blindly waving some Dene-Caucasian flag. Everyone is aware that there is significant work yet to be done. But at the end of the day, everything comes down to how compelling the evidence behind the proposal actually is. So let's take a look, shall we? So what do we know about phonology? Well, nothing conclusive, I can say that. In many publications concerning Dene-Caucasian, the phonological system presented is actually just Starostin's Sino-Caucasian. I'll put that on screen now. And the phonology of Sino-Caucasian itself has been criticised by scholars like Vovin and Van Driem as being unrealistically complex. Now, the reason that Na-Dene data is missing in their 2015 State of the Art, according to Bengtson and George Starostin, is that there was no reliable Na-Dene phonological reconstruction to use at the time in question. The authors disregarded the system set up by Vida in his Yeniseian proposal, and Leah's work from 2010 seems ignored. However, there are some elements of the Dene-Caucasian phonological system which can be described. It likely had a very extensive consonant inventory with a three-way contrast between voiceless, glottalized and voice stops, 3 series of sibilants and of sibilant affricates, and a number of laterals. The vowel system of Dene-Caucasian is even less studied and more obscure, so we won't go into that today. Earlier on, I mentioned how linguists seem to be particularly impressed by the correspondences between Na-Dene and Caucasian. Here we do have some interesting data to look at. Lexical correspondences form by far the bulk of the weight behind Dene-Caucasian. On screen now we have something quite interesting to look at, namely a version of Nikolaev's original comparisons filtered by Bengtson to leave us with a concise version of what is considered to be the most valid correspondences, with a focus on Na-Dene and Caucasian. As you look through the correspondences, the first in this column are always from the Na-Dene family, the second from Caucasian, and the following will be any other parallels in other branches. There are a few from Proto-Sino-Tibetan, Basque and Burushaski. I have to stress, however, that in the literature there are many more lexical correspondences than what I've been able to present here. If you're interested, please do consult the text for more detail, but here I've tried to present just some of the more stronger parallels. And perhaps here it's a good opportunity to look at some of the data presented in David Bradley's 2023 article on the ancient connections of Sinitic, which was actually brought to my attention in the comments section of a previous video by Patrick421, so thanks for that, buddy. But long story short, Bradley goes over some of the proposals out there attempting to link Sino-Tibetan to a larger language macrofamily. Bradley notes that the similarities between Sino-Tibetan and other East Asian language families are likely the result of contact. However, those similarities between Sino-Tibetan, Na-Dene and Yeniseian are deemed to be of a distant genetic nature, at least according to the researcher. Now, obviously it's not quite the full mix of Dene-Caucasian languages, but it still features some of the key branches. Bradley notes previous work done by Kavanagh on a potential genetic relationship between Na-Dene and Sino-Tibetan, himself inspired by Vida's Dene-Yeniseian, and presents some interesting sound correspondences, as you can see on screen now, alongside highlighting the complex consonant systems of the language families involved and their tendency to be both verb final and develop tones. What about the morphological structure of Dene-Caucasian? Well, luckily for us, Bengtson and George Starostin have summarised what the community has managed to reconstruct about Dene-Caucasian. Let's go over what they found out. The main word classes would have been noun, verb, pronoun and particle, with adjectives as a subset of verbs. Dene-Caucasian was likely verb final. And Dene-Caucasian probably had an extensive system of noun classification or gender, with modified versions of the original Dene-Caucasian system still found functioning in Caucasian, Burushaski, Yeniseian and Na-Dene. Sino-Tibetan and Basque lack these, but there may be some evidence of an earlier Dene-Caucasian noun classification system in these languages in fossilised forms. On screen now, we can see some examples researchers have put forward of such forms, with Basque on the left and Tibetan examples on the right. The following table summarises what can be deduced about the Dene-Caucasian case system. The genitive seems to have the most compelling correspondences, and there's evidence for at least 4 more cases, but Proto-Dene-Caucasian likely had many more. The subject case, where the nominative or absolutive did not require explicit marking. Also, it is worth noting, as we can see in the table, that some of these case functions have shifted in the descendant languages. This is probably to be expected considering the time depth involved, with Na-Dene languages showing the greatest degree of innovation and shift. The final case, listed as instrumental ergative, this ending only has an ergative function in Basque. The remaining evidence seems to point towards an instrumental function. And here it's probably a good time to take a look at the following suffix. Weider has identified in his Dene-Kaukasian hypothesis that this suffix converts verbs into nouns denoting tools. And sometimes Weider lists this as an example of the instrumental case in Na-Dene. However, Bengtson and Starostin clearly point out in their 2015 paper that the suffix only functions as a nominalizer with no case marking function. Either way, Weider has written about this suffix extensively in his work on Dene-Yeniseian, and it seems to be a promising correspondence linking Na-Dene and Yeniseian. We can actually see an example of this form in action in Navajo, where the following verb stem, meaning to carry on the back, can be turned into the following noun, meaning pack, backpack, burden. Proto-Yeniseian has the following form, meaning mat, and it is reflected in the following ket term, also meaning mat. And these forms originate from the verb to lie with the addition of the instrumental suffix. Interestingly enough, there is some teasing evidence of the same suffix appearing in East Caucasian. Take a look at the following stems and derivatives. The evidence surrounding this suffix in East Caucasian is limited at the moment, and these correspondences may well just be chance resemblances, therefore more examples need to be identified. Now, one thing that immediately jumped out at me when I was thinking about the languages inside Dene-Caucasian that we have already looked at on this channel, so for example Basque, Northwest Caucasian, Burushaski and Yeniseian, is that they all possess extremely complex verb morphology. Bradley, in his research that we looked at earlier, also confirms the striking resemblances between Sino-Tibetan, Yeniseian and Na-Dene in terms of verb structure. And of course Weider dedicated a whole chapter to discussing the similarities between Yeniseian and Na-Dene verb complexes, noting that the Yeniseian verb is similar to that of the Na-Dene verb but dissimilar to that of its nearest neighbours. The Dene-Caucasian verb could take a number of prefixes and suffixes. It's difficult to say anything about the function of the affix in each specific position, but Vida noted when discussing the Dene-Yeniseian verb that there appeared to be some evidence of a layering of affixes onto the verb stem, and that we can identify an older and younger layer of affixes. It's possible, therefore, that something similar existed in Dene-Caucasian. Maybe valency and class markers represent the oldest affix layers, with other marked categories in the verb chain, such as tense, mode and aspect, being later additions. Bengtson and Starostin note that if both subject and object are referenced in the same verb complex, the object typically comes before the subject, and that this is attested in Basque, Northwest Caucasian, Burushaski, Yeniseian and Na-Dene. Take a look at the following data on screen now, which looks at some common verb affixes found in at least 3 of the Dene-Caucasian branches. This table is a combination of data from Bradley and Bengtson. Please note that even though the Athabascan negative prefix doesn't appear to be cognate with the forms in Sino-Tibetan, Ket and Caucasian, it's still a prefix, and as Bradley notes, this is something typologically unusual for verb final languages. The past tense affix is found widely in Dene-Caucasian, and Bengtson provides us with some example sentences of it in action. I mentioned towards the beginning of this video that Dene-Caucasian is sometimes seen as some generic grouping of languages that don't quite fit in some other, more established language family. Researchers even comment that Dene-Caucasian is occasionally referred to as the garbage bin of Eurasia, presumably because you can just throw anything into it. This is somewhat unfair, and as Bengtson and Starostin point out, Dene-Caucasian has its own specific features. Not every language fits to it. Dene-Caucasian can be defined as a proto-language with a rich phonological system, a polysynthetic verb structure with several affix positions, noun morphology with at least 4 classes, and a number of lexical terms reconstructible from correspondences in its daughter languages. These characteristics explain why Yeniseian is considered a Dene-Caucasian language, while Nifk, another Paleo-Asiatic language, is not. The structural and lexical differences between the various Dene-Caucasian branches are attributed to a range of plausible influences by supporters of the theory. For example, Na-Dene languages are thought to have retained phonetic complexity due to their proximity to other relatively phonetically complex languages in North America. Conversely, Yeniseian languages lack shared agricultural and livestock breeding terms with Caucasian and Burushaski, likely because they split from the core Dene-Caucasian languages before the Neolithic Revolution. While we can describe what this hypothetical proto-language might have looked like and even speculate about its history, this reconstruction remains speculative and does not confirm the actual existence of such a language family. We need deeper research into the constituent languages themselves before we can adequately assess Dene-Caucasian. We need to better understand, for example, and have greater consensus around things like the reconstruction of Proto-Basque, Proto-Na-Dene, the development of Burushaski, and so on and so forth, before we can make any deeper conclusions about their wider genetic affiliations. The Dene-Caucasian hypothesis puts a lot of emphasis on certain fossilised forms found in its daughter languages. These forms point us to an earlier version of the language that would have more closely resembled other Dene-Caucasian tongues. Take the proposed fossilised prefixes in Basque being evidence for an earlier noun class system. Well, the problem is experts on Basque like Larry Trask have argued tooth and nail against the segmentation used to derive these speculated prefixes, arguing that there is no evidence for ancient prefixes in Basque. On the other hand, however, the similarities between the verb complexes of Sino-Tibetan, Yeniseian and Na-Dene are really curious. Dene-Caucasian has overcome many hurdles in its development, yet at the moment needs to overcome many more before we reach that most elusive point in linguistics: consensus amongst specialists. Well, there really is a lot of material to cover when talking about the Dene-Caucasian hypothesis, and similar to other proposals concerning long-range language family connections, it has been impossible for me to cover everything in today's video. So if you are interested in taking that deeper dive, please do check out the original research for yourselves. That being said, I do hope I've managed to select some of the more interesting and appealing correspondences that go towards supporting the Dene-Caucasian hypothesis. And as always, more than anything, I'm really interested in what your opinion on the proposal is. For me, I'm a little bit unsure because there's many different threads that we have to disentangle when talking about the Dene-Caucasian hypothesis. And I think some of those subgroupings within Dene-Caucasian, like for example Dene-Yeniseian and its relationship with Sino-Tibetan, do look appealing. But whether we have enough evidence today to say that we can support the Dene-Caucasian hypothesis, that I don't know. But as I said, I'd be really interested in reading your opinions. So please do leave a comment if you've got something that you'd like to share. Now, if you like this type of content and you enjoyed this video, please, if you could do me the greatest of honours, drop me a like and a subscribe if you haven't done so already. You can also support me via super chats, but to be honest, any form of support, whether it's just telling a friend, giving a like or a subscribe, is really greatly appreciated. I'll be back very soon with another video, probably on a long-range language family proposal. I've been Learn Hittite. You as always have been fantastic. Goodbye for now.